So I'm happy to be talking about Celtic art. Um, I studied this, God, I'm going to say it's almost 50 years ago when I studied Celtic art and discovered it. It was an exciting discovery. I was lucky enough to have a professor who was one of that group of professors who had to flee Germany, or had to, well, in his case, definitely from Germany, because of the onset of the war. And he was in his last stages of teaching when I took his course. Um, and he had a great love for Celtic art and a great sensibility for it. And so I was privileged to be able to take his course. And it stuck with me all these years. I still remember him very well. And I remember, I hope, some of what he taught me. So it's a real delight to be able to talk about it tonight for you. So I think most of you have some familiarity. Certainly you're learning about the Celts in general as you are reading the Caesar and the Gallic Wars. But most of you probably already do have some Celtic sensibilities. If you are at all fond of the Arthurian legends and have any interest in things like, well, even the Hobbit series, then you already are somewhat imbued with Celtic sensibilities. The picture I show you on the left is the statue of Arthur at Tentacle Castle. And for those of you that are of Irish descent, you may well have some response to things, particularly of Irish Celtic origin. You may wear a Celtic cross, and the piece I'm showing you in the picture on the right is actually a Celtic cross from the Greenmount Cemetery here in Burlington, because there was indeed an Irish population that came over and established themselves in the late 19th century here in Burlington. And one of the things that they participated in many ways was what we call the Celtic Revival. So Celtic sensibilities, particularly from the British Isles, have a strong role to play in our sense of things. And I'm going to ask you again, since I'm not seeing any faces, I just need to make sure that you're still hearing me.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the interesting thing is that we actually don't have a lot about the Celts, in the sense that since the Celts themselves didn't write until very late, and the sources that we have for the later period are all heavily contaminated by the fact that most of them come out of the Christian period, and they're almost exclusively coming out of Ireland, that they give us ideas of what was happening on the continent, but through the lens of a quite different set of experiences that occurred in the Ireland itself. They help us up to a point, but not much. The sources we have, Greek and Latin sources, useful as they are, in some ways don't speak about the Celts from inside. They talk about the Celts from the point of view of an observer. And much as Caesar can be looked at as a quite good ethnographer for his time in many ways, he still is looking as a Roman at what he saw and what the Romans in general saw. In fact, we don't even really know what the Celts called themselves. We know they were divided into tribes. That's certainly what we get in the Gallic Wars, but we know that even more so. That seems to be earlier the case as well from our other sources. So the concept of tribal identity seems to be a very strong one in the Celtic history. How far back that goes, we can't tell, but we normally, at least from the archaeological point of view, date the beginning of Celtic culture to probably somewhere in the between 1200 and 800 BCE. This is a period that archaeologically we call the Hallstatt period, named after the site of Hallstatt in Austria. It's a period of time largely dominated by very strong warriors. The Germans have given them the title of princes, and so we still refer to them that way. Though whether they were princes quite the way we think about is a different matter, but they clearly were strong men, and they were buried with very rich accoutrements. We think they controlled territories and had under them, obviously, a mass amount of people in various capacities. So we can assume that perhaps the Hallstatt society was divided into different tribes that warred with one another. But by we hit the second period of time, the period that begins about 500 BCE, in which we call by the name of another site, the name La Tène, which is named after a place on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. We clearly are in a world of tribal affiliations. But whether these people identified themselves as a unit in the same way Greeks saw themselves as unified, at least by language and by shared cultural concerns, is more difficult. We don't know whether that's the way the Celts saw themselves. And so it's possible that they never would have understood the terminology that we use when we group them all together under the term Celt. When we look at the imagery of the Celts, we get very contrasting views. On the left, probably the most famous statue associated with Celts. This is the supposed Roman copy of a lost monument that had been erected by Attalus I, the king of Pergamon, to celebrate his victory over the Galatians, who were a Celtic group that had invaded Asia Minor and were threatening Pergamon. And in a series of a couple of different campaigns, Attalus and Eumenides, his son, defeated them, and Attalus erected a monument. That much we know for sure. The monument itself doesn't really exist, though there are some elements that people have thought are part of the monument. But what we do have is a series of sculptures now in Rome, actually, though where they were really discovered and where they were used during the Roman period is not clear. They're marble copies of what we assume was a bronze monument, and whether they are actual replicas of the real statues or somewhat free-based copies, we have no idea. But one assumes that an image like this, which is a slightly over life-size statue, which stood somewhere in Rome, my guess is a bath complex. I think 2nd century CE, though many people date it to the 1st century BCE, but I think that's too early for it for a variety of reasons. It is a sculpture that shows a very heroic image in the form of what we call Hellenistic style of a Celt. We identify him as a Celt because he wears, so it's hard to see in my picture, a neck ring or a torque, which is an element that we know from literary sources that Celts did wear, and he is shown nude. And the nudity can be one of two possibilities, that we are looking at a representation of a Celt at war, because we are told that Celts fought in the nude, or we're looking at a very standard Greek concept of heroic nudity. Therefore, the representation of the enemy is presented to us in heroic form as a worthy opponent. But the hair, though you can't see it, the mustache, all identify his ethnicity as non-Greek, which is a fairly common feature of sculpture in the Hellenistic world, which in this case we would argue the Romans have continued. It gives us, however, all of the standard classical conceits for how to represent a heroic figure, in this case of the other, but in noble form, dying from his wounds. On the opposing side, I give you a statue of a Celt by a Celt, part of the Celtic Empire or the Celtic world that had developed very late. This was a piece that was produced in what is today the Czech Republic, which really doesn't become part of the Celtic world until probably sometime after the 4th century BCE. He too wears a torque, as you can see, what's called a buffer edge, because the two edges they don't form a complete circle. But as you look at it, you can see it's a little different in terms of what the artist is stressing. Instead of the tousled and rather wild hair of the Celt on the Greek consideration, his hair is neatly combed back. His eyes are set very close together. The artist isn't particularly interested in the reality of what the face looks like. In fact, one could argue the face has been reduced to a few key figures or few elements that identify the face. But much of the information or much of the stress is perhaps placed on the mustache, which, while present on the Greek statue, is nowhere near as important as it seems to be on the Celtic statue. It would help if we knew where this head really had come from, in the sense that we knew its purpose. We don't know whether it was part of some sort of funerary monument, though by this point in time, we don't have a lot of new sculpture on funerary structures, but perhaps it had been a sort of residual piece. Perhaps it came from a sanctuary. We don't know. But at least it tells us that Celts in the 2nd century BC, and this date is highly perplexing in some ways, were representing the human form in certain cases. Celts most assuredly participated in imagery that they drew from the Mediterranean world. From as early as the 8th century BC, the last stages of the Hallstatt group that I mentioned, we know there was trade, and quite extensive trade, into the Mediterranean. And Celts were bringing back a variety of things, including ideas. And beginning with the Latin period from about 500 BC on, we know that Celtic military figures, Celtic warriors, were serving as mercenaries throughout the Mediterranean. So with that in mind, they were at least exposed to what was going on in centers of classical culture. And some of that they did bring back with them and does show up. What I want to start with, though, is looking at what the Roman legions under Caesar's command would have seen as they marched into Gaul. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that there are sort of a couple of things going on. The Celts themselves, and I'll use the general term just because, as I say, it makes it much easier, but keep in mind that it may be a misnomer to give all these people that name. But we certainly know that in the 4th century BCE, the Celts had begun to expand. This is the period when Celtic fervor seems to have been brought forward, perhaps because of shortage of land. There are a variety of suggestions. They moved south over the Alps and into the Po River Valley and quite deep into Italy. They both as a resident population in the Po Valley and then as mercenaries, quite far south, into Apulia even, we have evidence of them. They were a force to be reckoned with. They even attacked Rome, as you know. So they were a major problem for the Italian peninsula insofar that they represented newcomers and aggressive newcomers. They also spread quite far to the east, into modern-day Czechoslovakia, or what used to be, into the Czech Republic and the Slovak republics, and then into Hungary, and then south into the Balkans. So they were also aggressive, and that eventually spreading all the way into Asia Minor, where, as I say, the Pergamines had to fight them. They had already spread, perhaps as early as the 8th century, over to the Iberian Peninsula. So by the 4th century BCE, they were quite extensive. Their aggression was felt. The attack on Rome, the attack on the Pergamines, the attack on Delphi. They were a frightening group. In the 2nd century BCE, the Romans begin to expand their power and push back. And so Caesar's campaigns into Gaul are in many ways the final movement to push the Celts back and to take control of the land. So there's been a period of roughly 150 years during which this has been going on, and one might say that he's the last of the great movements, with the exception of the invasion of Britain under Claudius. As the Romans moved north, they encountered a world that strange to them, but also one they somewhat understood. At this point in time, what we refer to as the late Latin, the Celtic society had somewhat shifted. It had inherited from the older Hallstatt world the idea of warrior leaders, warrior princes, if you like, who seem to have controlled territory and bands of armed warriors, and then a large peasant population associated with them. And we find their remains largely in burial in burial settings. The world of the 5th and 4th and 3rd century, at least so much as we can tell, was not a world of cities or towns. It was perhaps a world of small agricultural settlements with a very strong man somewhere in association, either in the town or somewhere nearby. These settlements perhaps fought with each other. They may already, as I said, represent different tribes. But by the time Caesar has invaded, that world has disappeared. The Celtic strongman has been merged into a warrior class from which a single individual might emerge. And these are the individuals that Caesar knows and accredits with certain power, a certain ability to motivate people. But the warriors that serve him also have power on their own, and they seem to be associated now with a newly emerging form known as an oppidum, what we would call a proto-city. And for Romans, this looked like the beginning of cities. They were walled, they contained elements that were associated with urban form in the sense that there were seemingly regions of the city given over to certain activities. There were particularly areas that we know were devoted to craft production, areas probably devoted to other kinds of functions, so that the cities looked somewhat like a Roman concept of a city, but without any of the normal architectural features that a Roman would have expected to find. Where most of the energy went in was in the production of great walls. So these cities were extraordinarily well defended, and you can see two examples of walls on my right-hand pairing. In fact, a particular kind of wall had developed, one that massed large amounts of stone and earth in layers separated by wooden wooden units to stabilize the wall. They could reach several meters of thickness. This is the Murus Gallicus that you're looking at in the lower slide. And they were also equipped with quite sophisticated gate systems, easily protected against assault. Now, it could have been possible that the need for this was the fear of the emerging Romans, but more likely, this was brought about by the threat of Germanic invasions. The eastern edge of the Celtic territories, now that we're under Celtic control or under some kind of Celtic cultural identity, were bordered by Germanic peoples, and those peoples had been there for quite a while. But now, because of stresses in Central Asia, which were pushing people in a westward movement, the Germans were being pushed further, and they were pushing into Celtic territory. So we think much of this defensible architecture is a result of that, which in some ways also assisted in the Celt resistance, at least initially, to the Roman invasions. Within the town, and you can see an example in my lower slide on the left of Ulla Stret, which is actually a little bit off base. It's over in the Spanish territories. But here you can get an idea. There wasn't particularly much in terms of architectural forms. The architecture was not where the Celts or any of these tribes chose to invest much. And in fact, that shows up also in temple design or sanctuary design. Romans would have recognized the idea of specialized areas set aside for religious purposes. This was true throughout the Mediterranean, but within the Mediterranean setting, whether one's talking about the Greek world or the Roman world or the Etruscan world for that matter, there was a tendency to offer an architectural element within a setting of a sanctuary. It wasn't mandatory, though it was always mandatory that there be an altar. But the norm was to have some kind of architectural embellishment within a sanctuary. The Celtic tradition doesn't seem to be that way at all. And so the slide I show you on the left-hand side in the upper left is probably a kind of representation of the area that would have been defined as sacred, perhaps with some kind of wall defining it. But most of it would have been an outdoor experience. The temples that I show you in the reconstructions are a product of the Romanization of the region after the conquest. So the idea was basically of a minimal amount of architectural embellishment from what we can tell. Clearly, it had nothing to do with an inability. The walls tell us that architecturally, in terms of building, the Celts were quite capable, and they were quite capable of borrowing ideas and reconfiguring them for their needs, because their defensive architecture shows the influence probably coming back from mercenaries who had served somewhere in the Mediterranean. So they did know something about defensive architecture as it had developed within the Greek and later in the early Roman stages. But when it came to building houses or building sanctuary sites, that was not where they pushed or chose to put influence or energy, I should say. And this is perhaps one of the important things to keep in mind about these people. They're quite capable of looking at foreign elements, deciding what of those might be useful to them, and then dismissing them, at least dismissing the parts they don't want. For example, as Romans encountered Celtic sanctuaries and religious settings, they would have recognized some things. The statue on the left was produced in a combination of cast bronze and sheet bronze. The body is sheet bronze, hammered, what we call repoussé. The head is more of a cast piece. It was found in a river setting, and so was probably offered as a sacrifice, perhaps of a nearby sanctuary. We don't have the sanctuary. At first sight, you might be able to immediately recognize that the artist for this does seem to have some sensibility that recalls classical form. The body looks coherent. The anatomy, at least of the torso, the arms look a little too high and the neck is a bit too long, but still one can appreciate the artist has some idea of what the body does coming out of the Greek and later Roman traditions. And the same might be said of the two items, or the statue on the right, which is a carved piece of limestone, a figure seated in a sitting position, our legs crossed, which also suggests that our artist has some awareness of what the body does. This is not an artist who is trained in these traditions. This is not an artist who has worked in them very much, but it is an artist who is capable of translating something else that is being shown to him or her, and I suspect these are hymns. It may be an artist who has seen these things and therefore knows how to produce them, or somehow is being shown them. But within this case, this would have been something a Roman could have understood. And the same is true of something like this. Now, this is a problematic piece. This is known as the Gundustrap Cauldron. It was found in a place in Denmark, Gundustrap in a peat bog. For a long time, it was thought to have been produced in the north, somewhere just outside or just within the northern range of the Celtic region because of its spine spot. Much more work has been done in this over the last roughly century. As I recall, it's found in the late 19th century. So a little over a century and a quarter perhaps. And now the general view is that this was actually produced somewhere in the very east, probably not in the Celtic region quite, perhaps just on its border in a place called Dacia, or perhaps in Thrace. But it somehow ended up in the Celtic world, probably because it worked enough for Celts that it made some sense and somehow ended up eventually deposited. It was very carefully deposited. It was taken apart, so it was not an accidental deposition. It was clearly a deposition for some purpose, some kind of sacred purpose, one assumes. It's a silver vessel that's gilt. You can see it on the top better than on the bottom, so it's been gilded. And silver is not a common material anyway within the Celtic range, so gold is quite common. But assuming that it was operative within the Celtic world, a Roman who might have encountered it would have been struck by it as strange. It wouldn't make sense to a Roman with classical sensibilities, but the two panels I show you on the right would have been something that a Roman could have begun to interpret. They do show figures, so therefore the figure on the, or the group, the panel on the bottom is probably best understood to be some kind of narrative, even if the Roman looking at it couldn't make much sense of it. Roman could see that this figure seated again cross-legged with the antlers, probably some kind of special figure the Roman would have understood, surrounded by animals that somehow have some kind of affiliation, I think a Roman would have assumed, and beyond that, he would have depended on someone to translate it for him. The same is true of the figure above. We can recognize that we are looking at something that purports to be human. The faces, at least, follow the normal elements we expect in a human face, so clearly the body is not so well understood, or at least it isn't concerning the artist in any of the three images that the anatomy make any sense. But the heads are clear enough. For both of these images and for the remaining images on this cauldron, if indeed it did operate within a Celtic setting, the Roman would have needed someone to explain what was going on, not just because the narrative for the panel on the lower panel wasn't at all obvious, but because obviously the emphasis is not where a classical artist would have placed it. So with that in mind, he would have turned to the other great group that exists that we know at this point, about which Caesar writes and about which we have some other information as well. And this was the group of priestly figures, of intellectuals, of judicial figures, since they seem to have bound all of this together in their role. And these were the Druids, who perhaps were capable of explaining this imagery or of making sense of it, so that once understood, the image might be comprehensible enough, though never an image of comfort, I suspect, to anyone coming out of a classical tradition. But then there are the things I don't think that Romans could have understood, things that would not have made sense to them at all. And this same would have been true for their Greek counterparts. The classical world is a world of the human form. The human form is what conveys meaning, whether the individual human or the human in some kind of activity in a narrative setting. That is the dominant element. Other features in classical art are present, but they're always subordinated to that which takes precedence. And it has since the 8th century, with the first production of great vases in Greece, where we see this dominant role played by the narrative and by the concentration on the conveying of that story using the human figure. The human figure was never important, really, in the Celtic world. It had a role to play. It could be used, as I've already shown you, but it was not where Celts placed the emphasis. And it was certainly not what they asked their artists to invest in. For Celts, the real concern was the production of imagery which largely spoke in another way. Now, the two pieces I'm showing you are a bit problematic because they come from British Isles. They come from southern England. The Celts only took over southern England beginning in the 4th century BCE. So it's not one of the heartlands of the development of Celtic culture or Celtic art. And because it's separated by the English Channel, it also developed somewhat, not really in isolation, but distinctly differently from what occurred on the mainland itself. So one always has to be a bit cautious about using British examples to understand what's happening on the continent. But there are some things that happen here that I think represent sort of the full development of Celtic sensibility and that were present in the mainland. And we probably would have more, except for the fact that I suspect a great deal of the Celtic art that existed in continental Europe was destroyed by the Roman conquest. The Romans were more than happy to melt down gold for obvious reasons. And objects of value in one culture, when devalued by another, normally do get destroyed. The reason we possess these two things from southern England is because the Battersea Shield, we think, was deposited as a sacred offering within a spring or in a water setting, rather, near Battersea Bridge in London. And the Desborough Mirror was a burial item, which was never dug up. So with these things in certain sequestered settings, we possess them. The Battersea Shield is a wooden shield covered in bronze, to which has been added these 3 decorative bosses. And the first thing to notice about them is their incredible interest in controlled, symmetrically aligned, linear patterning. The same is true of the Desborough Mirror. This is an incised decoration. It's a combination of incision to define these shapes and then to separate them with hatching, and that's what the darker areas are, and you can see them in the little inset. These are carefully hatched, like the work of an etcher, which then sets off the areas that have been inscribed basically as separate shapes. And one of the reasons I show it to you both in two different ways, as you can see, that the mirror actually changes in terms of what you see. But the other thing to notice about both of these is it's very hard to determine what's more important, the foreground or the background. We know that the production of these things was carefully controlled. As Celtic artists were commissioned to make pieces like this, they depended heavily on the use of a compass. The compass gave them this continuous linear control so that the line forms and defines the shape and the artist never loses the control of it. And the other thing the line does is it swirls in and out of itself. You can see that best on the Battersea shield. If I can move my little arrow, if I can find my arrow, come on, where's my arrow? There it is. You can see it swings in and out, and then out again. And the other thing to notice, oh, I don't want to be over there yet. Not quite yet. Let me go back. The other thing to notice is that it constantly shifts so that sometimes the line is quite thin, as it is here, and then it will thicken. And the places where it thickens have been set off with inlay. These are enamel inlays. These are glass inlays, so that you see them. And you particularly see that in the boss. Here's the symmetrical alignment, and your eye, if you let it, just follows it. And you begin to realize, is this the shape that you're supposed to look at? Or is this the shape that you're supposed to look at? And you realize that this shape doesn't exist without this shape, but you can't determine which shape is more important. They're balanced. That foreground background balance is a distinct feature of Celtic art, something you would never find in a classical piece. You would always know which is subsidiary to which. But this willingness to play with the forms and to let the eye move is one of the great discoveries that Celtic artists made. And to a Roman, this would have made no sense at all, I would argue. And as I certainly looked closer at this art that maybe they could understand, these seated figures, when they put them into the context, then it was an entirely different setting. This is a sanctuary outside of modern-day Marseille, which is why it's located in the museum in Marseille, a site that's been known for well over 100 years, a place called Rocbertus. It is a sanctuary probably to some kind of combined god. This is in the Ligurian region of southern France and northern Italy, which the Celts controlled, but had not completely subsumed the Ligurian people. So we suspect that this is a divinity somehow that combines the two. But what it also combines is something that the Romans do write about, and which definitely concern them, because if you look here, you'll see the little niches on the gates, on the pillars that held up the entranceway. And these are the pillars that held skulls. These are a sanctuary dedicated to the presentation of decapitated heads. And probably it was a site that, at least to some degree, engaged in human sacrifice, though how much human sacrifice occurred in the Celtic region, we're not sure. But it was certainly something which concerned Romans. The other thing that would have perplexed the Roman world, or Roman legionnaires looking at all of this, is that this is really the only place where one finds sculpture, only within a sanctuary setting, and occasionally on a tomb, but really in the Latin period, not very often. Sanctuaries were the only place for it. There really is no world of public art. The idea of presenting statements using visual form that carry political meaning, social meaning, any kind of propaganda was simply not being done within the setting of Celtic art. where Celts would make grand statements was in the setting of the sanctuary. And here at Rocbertus and in a couple of other isolated examples, the statements being made would have been most disturbing to Romans. The statement about the skull, as you see it in the restored gate on the left, where the holes are clearly indicated, where the skulls would have been placed, and one assumes allowed to become defleshed in time. And on the right, two statues, also both from France, which show a monstrous figure, perhaps a lion, more likely a wolf, standing with front paws on human heads. Where this interest in the decapitated head comes from is not quite clear. We do know that Celts were an Indo-European people. We know that their travels to the west took them through the steppe region, probably, and into Europe. We also know that the other great steppe group that emerges about the same time the Celts are emerging are the Scythians, at least in the western steppes. We know that the Scythians, based primarily on Herodotus, did engage in decapitation of defeated warriors, defeated foe, that they used those skulls, even turning them into cups. This may be some kind of shared item that the Celts carried with them, that the Scythians also developed. We do think that there was contact, at least on the very eastern edge of the Celtic world, with the Scythians, and we do know there's evidence of Scythian burials in Celtic territory. So there was some interaction, but how much we could debate, and whether or not the Scythians somehow inform this, or whether it's a shared feature. It's not a shared feature, certainly, of all Indo-Europeans. We don't find it among, obviously, Greeks. We don't find it among Romans or any of the other Italic peoples. We don't find it among the Indo-Europeans who went to the east. So we don't find it among the peoples of Iran or the Sogdians, or for that matter, the people of the Tarim Basin. So it is a distinct feature that seems to be something that we find here in Celtic society, and as I say, also within Scythian. But it would have been a troubling item, if we know it was, because the Romans do write about it. Now, the great age of Celtic power, and one might argue the great first flowering of Celtic art, occurs in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, when the Celtic world is at its greatest expansion. This is, for all intents and purposes, a martial expansion, though probably driven more by, we think, the need for land than the formation of any kind of Celtic empire, because the Celts never were united. There never was a sense, as I say, as far as we can tell, of a central kind of notion of who they were. But there was seemingly a push, and this is what led Celts first south into Italy and then east into the territories of Eastern Europe. When the Celts present themselves in self-form and self-identification, as they do on a piece like this fibula, which is a kind of safety pin to join together a cloak, or join a cloak to an undergarment, it depends on how it's being used, a gold piece, which is fairly common for art at this point, and a piece that probably comes from a warrior's grave, though it doesn't have a good context to it. We see the presentation of the Celt as a warrior. That was the way. The artist for this is clearly well-versed in classical form, though one could argue about the sophistication of the treatment. You can see all the parts are fully articulated. This is an artist who very much knows what the human form is doing, and for that matter is even playing with the nude male form. So this is an artist who has probably spent some time in the classical world and has produced this quite miniaturized form, because this is only about, as I recall, about 5 inches in terms of the whole fibula. It may be a bit longer, but it's certainly not a big piece. So Celts were quite capable when they wanted to, or Celtic artists, one should say, are quite capable of producing forms that clearly reflect the classical world. And one can also see this in the bowl at the bottom. As the Celts moved out into the classical world, they, as I say, served as mercenaries, but they also engaged in massive trade. And their trade points were in a couple of different spots. One was down here, which is where the modern city of Marseille is located, which was an ancient Greek colony. A very old one, had been really established in the 6th century. So Celts had an immediate point of contact with Greeks, who also sort of occupied this region. This is the Ligurian region as well. They also established themselves up here on the top of the Adriatic. Now, this gives them access to two different groups of people. Here, they're directly associating with Greeks. These are Eastern Greeks from Phocaea. And they are in contact, I keep losing my arrow. Where's my arrow? There's a Greek colony right down here. So this is a territory that really does and keeps getting fed again with Greek material because of trade relationships. So in this area, they could interact with Greeks. But over here, their interaction was with Etruscans from up in here. And it seems to be, in many cases, much more this region that supplied a lot of what was coming in. It seems that the Etruscan element was more interesting to them. And often they might borrow Greek forms, but they borrowed them through the intermediaries of Etruscan. So this bowl, which is a wooden bowl, surrounded, or rather embellished and given greater value, if you like, with all of this gold work that's been placed on it, is all making use of Greek vegetal motifs. Now, granted, you might have a trouble seeing them because they've already been reprocessed. But what you're looking at is palmettes and lotus blossoms, two vegetal motifs that occur quite regularly on Greek vases. And we know that Greek vases were penetrating this region. They were coming in primarily because the Celts seem to have become very early drinkers of Greek wine, and eventually probably also of Italian wine. And with it came all of the accoutrements for the drinking of wine. And that meant they wanted vessels to mix wine and water, though they tend to have used them more often, it seems, for either serving wine uncut with water or for actually serving mead, because in a couple of examples, we actually can find traces of mead. And then they wanted the drinking cups, which is what we find in the tombs. So it is probably from that source that they are seeing these motifs. And from those motifs, they are reconstructing them, breaking them down, and re-putting them together and repurposing them in this massive gold decorative work on the bowl itself, increasing the value of a wooden bowl substantially. And they're going to do more with these decorative elements. In these two helmets, the Anfreyville Helmet here, which you see, and then in a drawing in watercolor of it below, and in a helmet from Condosa de Puglia. Both of these are ceremonial or parade armor, one might call them. Neither of them was ever intended to be worn. They're both helmets that were made at a particular moment. They have a particular style that we can more or less date them from. And they're clearly Celtic, but they've been given increased value. They are bronze in the case of the Anfreyville helmet, but that bronze has been given greater value by the use of gold to decorate it, as you see here, and the inlays of coral, which you see here. This is an iron helmet with bronze decorative work and inlays of coral. Now, the coral is an import. It's coming up from the Bay of Naples. So not only are these Celts bringing into their territory finished products like Greek vases and in some cases Etruscan bronze work, but they're also bringing up raw materials that they have value, or for their purposes have value. And in this case, it's this coral, the red coral from the Bay of Naples. And then in some cases, they are augmenting that coral with glass, which they knew how to produce and would use to augment the coral to produce these items. But what interests me about them is the decorative motif, which you can see better in the watercolor. Here you can see that linear pattern again. And ultimately, this goes back to vegetal motifs. Basically, what's done is a palmette that's been broken apart. But now it's been reduced to all of these linear forms. And in fact, they've been arranged into groupings of 3. And you can see it very nicely in this one, what we call triscles. Here is the palmette in its original form. And here it is as it gets broken down into it. But the other thing you can see is how controlled this is. One triscle joins another triscle. And they just flow right into one another. And you can also begin to see that the line is controlled, but then it's allowed to open up and then to collapse again. Perhaps a little harder to see in this one, but there it is. There's your pattern. There it comes down. There it goes up. It's another triscle, though it's a little bit different in the way it's been executed. And again, that's carefully controlled all the way through, so that one never loses the sense that the artist knows exactly how these things lead into one another. And there's a sense of movement. So yes, the origin of this is a foreign origin, but it's been transformed into something quite different. And in both these cases, what's been done is to use the decoration, and in this case, the materials that are part of that decoration, to increase the value of the object being treated. These objects begin to give us a sense of that what Etruscan artisans are being asked to do is to create something that is quite novel. The question becomes, of course, why? What's the purpose of this art? Since it doesn't have a public display element, not part of, as far as we can tell, gifts to a sanctuary, because occasionally this shows up in, particularly in water settings. So one assumes that perhaps it's a sanctuary associated with a river or with a spring or something, but not enough of it in that setting to suggest that most of this is being produced for a religious purpose. One assumes most of that just ends up finally as a gift to a particular god within that setting. Where we really find this stuff is within grave settings. It's being produced primarily as status art. It's art, the purpose of which is to embellish the person who possesses it in the form of objects that can be worn or displayed on the person, whether that's the Battersea shield, whether that's the ceremonial helmets, or whether that's something like this, the armband or arm ring that was found in a warrior's grave from a place called Rodenbach in Germany. It's interesting for a variety of reasons. The actual tumulus that you see in the picture on the left is a Hallstatt tumulus that dates from the very end of the Hallstatt period. So it is a tumulus that belongs to the period that either leads into the Celtic, or some people would call the Proto-Celtic. Into that tumulus was dug a second grave sometime in the 5th century, which was the grave of a warrior. That warrior was buried with the normal attributes of a warrior, a sword, and primarily a sword, and then with it, this armband, which you see in the photo on the right. This armband, intriguingly, has a certain amount of this repurposed elements coming out of the borrowing of classical form in the decorative ends, but much more interesting, if I can get my, is this element right here, which you can see better here, which is the other thing that goes on in Celtic art. Those decapitated heads may well have had a distinct history. They may belong within some kind of development of the Western steppes that both Celts and Scythian partook of before they separated and came different ways. But it's also true that Celts seem to have become extremely fond of the motif of the decapitated head. And we find it regularly in Celtic art. quite separate from anything to do with sacrificial victims, if that's what we are looking at in a place like Rocbertus, or the concept of the warrior whose head is taken as the prize. The head alone seems to be of interest, and it becomes a decorative motif on Celtic art, and given primacy of placement, so that everything about this band or armoring is designed, as you can see on this side and this side, in symmetrical arrangements to frame the head and face. It is clearly the most significant part of the design. This willingness to take forms and break them apart can be seen particularly if we look at Celtic coinage. Interestingly enough, the Celts adopted coinage earlier than the Romans. They clearly were introduced to it in the Greek world, where, as I say, they had begun to serve as mercenaries. Greeks had developed coinage in the 6th century as one of the features of economic life. Coinage was an important feature in the Greek world. It was used in a variety of ways. And Celts seem to have picked up on the value of coinage, and they actually minted quite good coinage in terms of the weight and the stability of that weight, which they must have used for economic purposes. And clearly within the oppidum period, or these individual towns, these oppida, there's evidence that many of them were minting coinage, and we have many of the coins from that period. So we know that coinage was circulating and was used, one assumes, for the economic value of it. But they also saw in it something else. So what you see on the left-hand side is a coin of Philip II, a silver coin that Philip II struck, showing the head of Zeus on the obverse and a youth riding on the reverse. Below it is a very early Celtic response to it, but still more or less looks recognizable. But as you can see on the right-hand side, as this coin prototype is picked up and the two motifs on it are subjected to a Celtic sensibility. These come from a variety of different tribal groups that we can identify in the East. Those elements are broken down. We still recognize a head, but that head is quite distant from the Philip II head of Zeus. And while we still recognize the horse, that horse is also subjected to substantial deformation. The value of these images is that they are becoming more and more interesting just visually. One might argue that the interest is in the elements that form the image, rather than in any element or any iconographic or symbolic meaning to the images, which is how they operate in the Greek world. What Celts are doing is not because they can't do the other. And I think that's always important to stress. As I've already shown you, even an artist who must look at a prototype in order to create the new form is capable of producing a recognizable human form. The artist who made the gold fibula I showed you a couple of images back was quite capable of producing a fully recognizable human form. Celtic artists could do it if that was what was being asked for. It was a decision not to do it because that wasn't what was being demanded. You can see this kind of change occur in something like this. The prototype is a jug, what we call a beaked flagon from the Etruscan region, a bronze piece. And it's retranslated by two different groups of bronze workers, one in a German region and one in the French region, though these terms are meaningless because those concepts didn't exist. Both of them share this very, very strongly accentuated metallic shape in which the edges become quite sharp. The concavity is now much more stressed than it is the convex form of the original flagon. The beak has been pushed out even further, and the separation between the neck of the flagon and the body of the flagon is accentuated with this very, very strong horizontal. All of this is the work of an extraordinarily good metalsmith who is playing with the forms. The body was raised in both cases from a single piece of bronze, and then the necks and the beaks were attached separately, as was the base on the French example. These were no doubt funerary objects, so we can't, the one on the right we know for sure is. The two on the left have a very strange history, but may well have been funerary objects. If we look at the lid, we can see, this is the Bazut's piece, we can see here's the inlaid enamel work and all the inlaid enamel work that defines the beak of the flagon. And to this, we have the addition of the animal element, which is perhaps to be understood as a wolf. So perhaps something that has a direct meaning within the setting of the Celtic world, where wolves certainly did roam the forest. So perhaps for that purpose. It's hard to appreciate this. My slide is too small, but all of this has been carefully worked with a compass so that the lines are quite controlled. And in the bottom, we have the interlace once again. And here's very clear interlace pattern being created and picked out. In this case, I'm pretty sure this was originally red coral, which has lost its color, if I'm not mistaken, set between the frame. What's been done is to take a bronze vessel, a prototype from the Etruscans, to reshape it into something that suits a Celtic aesthetic, and then to embellish it, to add value to it through the additional work, all of which testifies to the skill of the artist. And that is perhaps the final thing to be stressed about all of this, is you're looking at works in which artistry counts, in which the skill of the artist is one of the things that is being displayed, and I think has importance. Artistry, skill of working these materials, was something that was valued enough, though we don't know the names of these artists. For that matter, we don't know the names of the individuals, for the most part, for whom these wings were made. But I'm fairly certain that within this social structure, the artist played an important enough role. These were skills that were worth maintaining and worth developing. So the destruction of Celtic culture was one of the results of Caesar's defeat of the Gauls. France became, or Gaul became, part of the Roman Empire and went through a process of transformation into a new world. And throughout that process, the old Celtic forms disappeared. The legacy of Celtic art continued over in the British Isles for another 100 years until the invasion, and then it too disappears. The only place where Celtic art will continue and where we can get one last sense of where this might have been going is, of course, Ireland. For roughly another 1,000 years, the Irish would continue as the isolated Celtic world, separated enough from developments on the continent, at least until quite late, the advent of Christianity and the tie to the continent through that. But Celtic art here bloomed and continued to develop. And I end by showing you two of the great masterpieces of late Celtic art, the Great Brooch from Tara, with that same kind of fondness for interlaced patterns, for controlled line, for symmetrical arrangements, and for that sense of order, and yet that movement and that constant sense that things are in change as that line shifts from one shape to another, and the translation of that tradition into a painted form in the great Cairo page from the Book of Kells, where all the artistry of the metalsmith is now in the hands of the painter scribe. And though my slide is not as good as I would like, I must say, I'm going to express my editorial comment. The world of slides was much better than the world of digital projection. But here, though it's hard for you to see it, is work that basically picks up on the same kind of thing you can see here. Here are running spirals that form these groups of triscles, just like I showed you in the metalwork on the Anfreyville Helmet. And you'll have to take my word for it, but here are little heads peeking through, just like on the Rodenbach, on the Rodenbach bracelet. Are you still with me, or have I just lost you all?
We're here.
Okay. So I am happy to take questions if any of you have them. And what I will do is I will stop my sharing. And anyone who might wish to ask a question, feel free. I can open my chat. If you don't want to talk, I can see whether anyone's putting a chat question. And otherwise, thank you for spending the last hour with me and letting me talk about Celtic art for a change.
Thank you, Bill. That was just a tour de force. Does not do justice to the amount of information that was and insight that was packed into that every second of that hour. So I hope everyone will. I know I will be using my tuition benefit to sign up for some of your classes as soon as I can, before either of us retire.
Yeah.
So I have a few questions, but I'd like to
Sure.
give other people a chance to go first. I will step back. Who would like to ask or observe something? There's something in the chat here, a couple things.
Sure.
We have
Hannah, what's your question?
Yeah, Hannah.
Hey, so I have a question about the decapitated heads in
Sure.
the ornate art with all of the decorations. Do you think that could it all be influenced by the Gorgon's head in Greek art, like on breastplates and things?
I have to admit, I never given thought to that. I mean, it's certainly not impossible. I don't think I guess I would tend to say my first response would be no, because I doubt that most of the artists themselves who are making this stuff would have ever seen that imagery. But again, since so much stuff was coming up on, at least from the Greek world, was coming up on black and red figure cups where that imagery does occur, it's possible, though I don't remember ever seeing a cup that shows that imagery, but that doesn't mean anything because it's not like we have every cup that ever came up. So it's certainly not impossible that the Gorgon was somewhere there. The only difference is my innate sense is that none of the Celtic artists were ever asked to produce art that led to a narrative, except maybe something like the Gundustrap Cauldron. So I don't think their art was intended to evoke a specific narrative, though it certainly could well have had something to do with stories that it could engender. Where the Gorgon story is very much a story, there's a very definite narrative that goes with. Is that a long way of saying I'm not really sure?
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I did have another question.
Sure.
So you said earlier that all of these artists had the capability of depicting the human form, but are they stuck in their styles, or why?
I think the thing is that as an artist in a pre-modern world, you don't make work to sell. You make work that you're commissioned to do. You're basically told what you need to do. And therefore, unless someone asks for you to do that, you have little reason to be producing it. And the chances are pretty good the materials that you're going to work with are materials that also come out of the commission. So in other words, you are a warrior and you want a gold armband. Well, you probably are going to have to supply the gold to the person who's going to make it. And so he isn't going to have, or she isn't going to have a lot of room to play around with other things. So I think on the whole, they weren't being asked to do it. And that wasn't where they were putting their energy. Just as Greek artists weren't being asked to produce, for the most part, largely areas of vast amounts of geometric patterning once you get into, say, the 6th century. That they can do it. They can clearly do it if on the borders of things. They clearly know how to do it, and they can do it very well. But it's not what they're being asked to produce.
Thank you.
A question from Kyle and then Sabrina.
Hi.
Hi.
I do worry that perhaps your answer to Hannah may partially answer what I'm about to ask.
Sure.
But I'm interested in, you discussed often the aesthetic and the sensibility of the Celts. Then in your final slide, you say that with the expansion or the conquest of Caesar, the Celtic aesthetic sort of dies out on the continent. And I just wonder, how does an aesthetic or sensibility die out? When you see an expansion of something like Rome, where as a historian, you hear about the quote unquote acceptingness of Roman culture as it expands. How does an aesthetic like the Celtic aesthetic get snuffed out?
It gets snuffed out primarily because those who would be most commonly commissioning things, which would be in this case what had been the warrior group. Now, I mean, you know that the Roman pattern was as much as possible to bring elites in and to, in a way, convince them to become Roman. But you don't become a Roman by retaining your sensibilities to another world. So you think of someone like Martial. Martial, at one point, in disgust, goes back to Bilbilis, and he writes a poem in which he calls himself a Celt-Iberian. But there's nothing in his poetry that reflects a Celt-Iberian sensibility. He's very much a Roman, and he doesn't want to be in Bilbilis, which is a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. I've climbed up to it. He wants to be back in Rome. And so he isn't going to foster this identity anymore, even if he's willing to state he is something for, dramatic effect. And I think that's what largely happens when you deprive artists of those who commission the works, or their aesthetic changes because it no longer works within the social fabric that they're now part of. That aesthetic is eventually going to die out. And I think that's basically what happened to Roman art. It'll eventually happen to Celtic art. Celtic art in Ireland will disappear. It'll be revived, but it's an intentional revival in the 19th century, mainly because eventually Ireland becomes much more engaged with England and continental Europe, and the art that they produce doesn't function anymore. But you'll have to wait briefly until about the 12th century for that to happen.
Not to tarry too long, because I know other people have questions, but can aesthetics show more resilience when they're inversely a folk art aesthetic then?
That's one of the great problems with trying to to figure out whether these things survived in the underground, as it were, because art history is by its nature prone to look for the glory pieces and not what everybody else wants. So we've tended to ignore a lot of them. And so there are some interesting questions. There's a style of English pottery, or Roman English pottery. It's a kind of blackware, which is decorated, which kind of looks like it still retains a distant memory of the Celtic stuff. And it clearly wasn't the fine ware. The Romans living in, the villas or in the fine houses in the Roman cities of Britain were eating off of imported redware. They're bringing it up from at least southern Gaul and then later from elsewhere where it was produced in North Africa. They aren't using this other stuff, or if they are, they're using it, in for the servants kind of thing. So there may be a survival if we knew how to look for it, or if we paid more attention. And I suspect, but then you have the question of whether that survival is just because people retain it, or do we want to see that revival or its survival as having something to do with rebellion? In other words, do people keep their identity by the kind of pottery they use, even when they can't remember their language? And you can see that happening today. Indigenous American groups are very much involved with this question of whether their identity is reflected in the art that's being produced, as they struggle with trying to figure out what to do about languages they're losing.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Sure.
Sabrina.
Hi.
So I just wanted to ask, and there might not be like any known recording of this, but is there a hint as to the names that the Celts used in their indigenous language to refer to their metalwork or culturally significant designs that they used in their metalwork? Because I know we use terms to refer to them as like people have researched them, but are there any that we know that are in their native language?
That I know of, none of them are preserved in the Latin or Greek sources. But that doesn't surprise me because the writers of those weren't interested in the art itself, and certainly not in preserving that kind of information. Whether or not there's information of what you're asking preserved in the later Irish sources, I don't know. I've honestly never thought of looking for it, so I don't know. It could be there. It would be buried in the Irish stories, particularly well, all of them for the most part, which talk about the pre-Christian period, and they do talk about the objects, things that glitter of gold, the light shining on gold. So yes, they for the Irish writers, they have a poetic sensibility of what these objects are, but I don't know that they actually describe the designs in terms of words that would be usable, and they aren't used in the literature. So contemporary art historians who do this material don't talk about them in those terms. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Could I jump in on
Sure.
that for a sec? So I've been just starting, working my way into the Irish mythology a bit via Lady Gregory's literary retelling, which is very enjoyable.
Yeah.
As you say, there are numerous. I'm struck by how many precious objects are described, which
Yes,
fits with the the idea of status symbols and so on. Precious materials are itemized. Decorative elements to a certain degree are there, but also within the imagery of the poetry, there's so many abstract, almost kind of trippy sort of image combinations just within the telling of the myths, like descriptions of the natural world and sort of describing human experiences in terms of natural imagery and so on, that you imagine that like some of the sort of, this is like just purely fanciful on my part, but I imagine that some of the abstract geometric master designs that Bill has showed us could themselves reflect on that world. They're sort of visually adjacent to that poetic diction, and there could be a certain amount of there must be a certain amount of overlap between those worlds of poetic production in different media, so that even if like specific technical terms for the volute or the spiral maybe don't survive, or maybe they do and we don't recognize them, like a certain amount of perceptions that go into the art, I would think would be would have left vestiges in these kind of traces in these kind of ways. Maybe. What do you think of that, Bill? Is that possible?
No, I think you're quite right. And the thing I didn't talk about at all, because we don't really know it for the continental setting, or even for that matter, the English setting, is the role of bards, because you know how important they become in the Irish setting. And one assumes that isn't an Irish creation. It must have been true for them. And that introduces the whole role that this art plays in the the sort of, you think of a bardic setting, you think of a group of these individuals dressed with this stuff, and the bard begins to produce the poetry in a musical form, and then the imagery comes out, and with it the references to what is being shown.
Yeah.
And we can't capture that. That's why I said I don't think the narrative matters in capturing the narrative. I think the objects are part of the narrative that will be told.
And maybe another way in which the Irish material is exceptional, besides being, on the fringe, the far western fringe, and so surviving for that extra 1,000 years. Something I read in connection with the myths and the bards is that with the Anglo-Norman kind of incursions into the island, some of that apparatus of elite patronage and so on was sort of disempowered, but sort of driven into the sort of the lower economic strata. And
Yeah.
so in a way like a number of diaspora phenomena are like this.
Exactly.
So that it's not just, folk, peasant, quote unquote, but you have this kind of infusion of high art that sort of is persisting and sort of self-perpetuating in exile, so to speak. And so that
And
maybe
that's the stuff that we can't grab hold of, that, or we haven't become very attuned to yet. But I think,
right.
I sort of hope as time goes on, not just for this material, but for all of this constant need to look at the way in which people survive after conquest or after being subsumed by another culture. There are ways. I mean, people are doing this in sort of colonial Latin American art a great deal right now. So any other questions?
Well, Phil Ambrose, did I see you raising your hand at one point? I may not have. I may have mistaken that. Anyone else?
Phil, you're muted.
Nobody else?
Maybe while Professor Ambrose unmutes, I can ask a question in
Sure.
the meantime. Now, I wasn't sure if there's maybe there's somebody else in the chat, but anyway, I will go now and we can check. I had
Now-
a couple.
Oh, sorry,
Sure.
there, Phil.
Go ahead, Professor Ambrose, please.
Oh, I just wanted to go back to the Puglia helmet.
Yes.
When I looked at that, I saw myself as the victim of this warrior, or the victim about to be. And what I saw in those typical Celtic swirls, I saw two eyes and a mustache and a warrior about to undo me. It was typical of armor in the Greek world. Poets describe it that the point of the design was to scare the holy bejesus out of the enemy. Is there any possibility that the artists who developed these wonderful hair-like lines knew how to put their stylistics together to invoke the human body or face?
Oh yeah. I think you've hit something. A lot of people have commented on this, not just for that helmet, but for many other pieces. And I think this is a case of the visual evidence seems fairly clear that was going on. That a lot of these objects, when you look at them, you begin to see the face popping out at you. And that helmet would be a classic example of that. And probably for exactly the reason that you're stating, which was it adds to the frightening aspect of the helmet, assuming that the victim had a chance to see it before being dispatched. But I think a lot of people want to draw back because the evidence for it is strictly the visual. There's no other reference to the objects working that way. But I think the combination of changeability and mutability that you sort of see throughout Celtic art suggests that the face is often buried in it. And we see it in later medieval art in the areas where we know there once were Celtic peoples. You see it particularly in things like the emergence of the green man, for example, from the dense foliage and in some church settings. So yes, I think that's exactly what's going on, and you're by no means alone in seeing that. And I think in the case of that helmet, for the very reason that you stated.
Well, thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. So Julia, you did have a question?
Yes. I was wondering, on the objects that you were talking about that seem to incorporate these Greek vegetal motifs, but in this kind of transformed way. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how you think those objects were read. So we talked about kind of their roots to the Celts and their prestige function, but in terms of, I guess my thought would be that there's an extent to which my first thought is that, oh, they're perceived as foreign, and then my second thought is maybe there was a kind of such an extended period of integration and such an extended period of interaction that there isn't this strong kind of like foreign native dichotomy. But if it is more complicated than some kind of binary, I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of.
I tend to think, as you yourself said, I don't think they were foreign. I think they've gone through enough of a transformation that they weren't perceived as anything other than belonging within the standard Celtic realm of what a commissioner would expect, and even an artist would expect to make. The fact that we can trace their roots is much more what we do. I mean, we spend our time trying to find the origin of these things, but I don't think from their point of view that was what was going on at all. What I can't tell you is why the first artist looked at a vegetal motif and said, oh, I can do this, but change it in this way. And then everyone said, oh, that looks really Celtic, or that's really suitable, and we like it too. That I can't explain. I have no idea how that process was achieved, but I suspect within a very short order, these things became synonymous with, I'll tell you a little story that isn't about Celts, but may help you. I was traveling many years ago in Jordan, and I was going through the border back from Egypt to Jordan, and standing next to me was a young Japanese couple who had been, interestingly enough, studying music in Morocco, I think. But the bottom line was we were chatting, and obviously at some point, what else do? You asked, well, do you miss anything from Japan? Because you've been in North Africa now for over a year. And they told me, yes, they really did miss Japanese cooking. And we said, oh, well, what do you miss? And they said, McDonald's. To them, McDonald's was Japanese. It was that simple. And when I went to McDonald's in Japan, it was still pretty McDonald's to my mind. So, but it had become incorporated enough from their sensibilities to be part and parcel of what they thought of as Japanese. And I think that's what happens here. I think these things no longer look foreign. They look like Celt. They look like what we should be doing.
That is fascinating and a really compelling example. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions? Did Sabrina have a question?
I think she asked it, unless she has another. Well, I mean, maybe in that case, anyway, this has been absolutely fascinating. I could stand here all night talking about this. If you want to stay later, I will.
I have to have dinner.
Yeah, but would our hosts like to do, our Goodrich officers, do you have business to transact that we should get off so that you can have the rest of your meeting, or do you have anything you have to take care of?
We didn't have anything specific planned, I don't think, did we, Megan?
No, we carved out the whole block for this wonderful talk, so I think we're good.
Okay.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Bill. It was really really fascinating, and
I'm delighted I could give it. Thank you
yeah.
for the invitation.
Yeah, let's get together and talk more about it.
We will.
Okay.
Once we can actually do that.
Yeah.
All
Okay,
right.
cool. Thanks. It's
Good
so
night
great
to
to
you
see.
all. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's great to see so many old friends too on the call, as well as current
Yep.
students. So, okay.
Talk
bye,
to you all
everyone.
later. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Well,